Hello, everybody. Aloha.
Aloha. Hello. Mingalaba.
Just remember, as usual, to take a few minutes if you like to look around, see who's here with us today, get a sense of the support of our community for the moment. Mm. Great.
So if you would like to let your attention connect with your body, sitting or kneeling or lying, standing. Sometimes it's helpful to tune into your body posture and see if there is any balance of feeling relaxed, upright. And already we're leaning into that shift from often a very active or doing awareness to a more receptive awareness. And often that shift can be aided a bit with calling in some kindness or care or tenderness. You hear us mention different words. Often the word care might spark some connection with care or kindness. Sometimes the word tenderness. Sometimes it's a feeling of a quiet connection or abiding with sometimes that connecting with our body with care lets us actually take a breath. Just one breath in a more relaxed way. So the receptive attention can often be more accessible for us when the awareness itself isn't hard or so judgmental. And I just wanted to mention at the beginning of our sitting to just check to see if there's any hidden agendas or expectations of what you might want from the sitting. And the expectation often gets in the way of connecting with just what's happening and being more receptive to what's happening moment by moment. So, of course, we might want less sleepiness or more kindness, or more calm, ease, equanimity, less lost in thinking, whatever. And just to be reminded that this is about our relationship to what's happening. As we all know, we can't control what appears. So the expectation causes so much suffering for us and gets in the way of this just receiving life just as it is. So we're not making expectation bad or wrong. We're just noticing it, seeing if we can understand it and see through it, not get caught in it, let it come and go, just like the breath and sounds. So letting the attention become aware of hearing right now, and receiving the silence or sounds right through the ear door, the textures, vibrations, changing moment by moment, appearing, disappearing by themselves. So a thought process might happen about them, and we notice thinking is happening, like hearing. And then you just bring the attention back to the vibrations and textures of the sound, not through the thought process. We start to notice the attention can start to settle in, bringing our attention to our hands and maybe with some kindness, care, tenderness. Being careful of just connecting with a visual image or a past memory of our hands, but just with whatever sensations are appearing moment by moment. Maybe some warmth or coolness, pressure, heaviness, tingling, numbness. this symphony of aliveness. Often from being connected with our hands, it's very close to our belly, abdomen. There's that practice already of just receiving whatever sensations are there, like a swell in the ocean. That movement of life, what we call breath. Not me, not mine, not I, just life revealing itself moment by moment. You get that sense that we can relate to whatever experiences are appearing and disappearing this way. Body sensations, breath, sounds, emotions, thoughts, mental states. Low energy, high energy. Most important is taking the time to receive the experience just as it is, without the visual images or past memories taking over. Let them come and go, and settle back into receiving. The textures and vibrations of happiness or sleepiness, or calm, breath, anger, doubt, restlessness, peace. They're not my or me or mine. Exploring without going through the thought process, rather than getting caught in the suffering of expectation. With tender care.
Thank you, Michelle. Hmm. I hope everyone is doing well this week, that your unpleasant experiences are dissipating and your pleasant experiences are arising and sustaining themselves. This past week, Michelle and I both had to go over to Honolulu. We got to visit Steve for a couple days, and Michelle had some things to do. I had some other things to do. I had to get a suit for something that I have to go to this fall, and I don't own a suit. So it was like a big adventure, not having left home, for a year and a half to get on an airplane, go to several days of malls and shopping centers with billions of people, it seemed like. And at the same time, I had to deal with something with the Bureau of Conveyances in Honolulu. And so it was a kind of like a particular a little adventure in Duca land of having to be stuck in traffic most of the time, in Ubers and stuff. It's like hours, in incredible traffic, going to the malls and then all in the meantime, all like kind of sending emails. I was supposed to go for a meeting at the bureau. It's very uninteresting, but part of why it's important is the mundane quality of it. I'll share with you, just like the Kafkaesque. We have a piece of land in North Kohala as an organization. For a long time, we've been in a process of subdividing it to sell a part of it to a neighbor. We have to go through a process with the land court in order to deregister it to be able to put it in the regular land system here, and that the law was changing. The law changed July 1st of like some technical thing that needed to be done differently, and so we tried to get this paperwork in before the first, but the title company that we had submitted held on to it for a few days and didn't register it until the third. So I was trying to get in touch with the bureau. I had a meeting at the Bureau of Conveyances to make sure that they were going to recognize it as having been something that was submitted on the 28th instead of the 3rd. But because I wasn't going in to actually submit a registration, they canceled my appointment, and there was no way to find out anything about our submission, right? Because they only uh, they only can search based on the check number that you send it in, but we didn't send it in with a check number. The title company sent it in with like some tar slip, and so it's just like it's like that. It's totally unimportant, the details of that, but it's just to say like that was the level of like constant like emailing, calling back and forth of just like this wall of bureaucratic um, putty, uh, that we never broke through. And so this I bring it up as this sort of very powerful, I felt like, experience of part of coming out of COVID and being more engaged in the world, and uh, the the mundane things of like these just errands, and things you have to do, and the particular quality of dukkha that can come from them, and how kind of amazing it was to really see to have this confluence of them, and um, and to really see the way in which, in terms of the meditation practice and our training, of course, there is a watching the mind, having these fantasies of the traffic is gonna like clear up, right? Like whatever this thing is, it's not really gonna take 2 hours to get, this like 5 miles away. This thing is gonna clear up, and this like hoping that the world will change, or hoping that okay, maybe it'll be like the first couple of places I go to I'll find something for myself that's gonna work. It's like not the 20th place I go to, or the bureau. Like I'm gonna actually speak with someone there, who is like, let me just go look, let me go take a look at your thing and let you know. um, and to see that, like, of course there's this expectation on the world around all of these things, and hope and this fantasy that things will work out according to need and want and plans, but that actually so much of the dukkha is around the grasping, the holding on to the expectation around mental satisfaction, right? It's not really just about what this person does or the traffic or X or Y phenomena. It's like it's the hope for relief of like, I can check this off. Like this thing is done. It's settled. Um, and the this longing and hope for mental satisfaction, for consciousness relief, um, that is so painful and so futile, really, um, in this world of changing conditions. But such an important reminder for me, um, of that so much of this practice is not just about letting go of our expectations of the phenomena of the world around us, or the phenomenon of what we're seeing or hearing or smelling or tasting, or the people we interact with, or the society we're involved in, or the bureaucracies we're involved in. Of course, those are these things of like we learn these spiritual lessons of letting go, of releasing those from our expectations, of seeing how much suffering comes from our expectation of those things, but also of letting go of our own expectations of our minds, of this hope for relief, of this fantasy of satisfaction that we think can arrive, right? Um, this wanting of the release and the relief through, um, through phenomena, that the mind itself has the capacity, that consciousness actually can be satisfying, that consciousness could be a relief, is part of the delusion, part of the fantasy that we are trying to break out of, relieve ourselves from, release ourselves from. I think it's not always clear. Of course, part of it's because we emphasize so much qualities of mind that are supportive of our liberation: investigation, energy, mindfulness, concentration, rapture, equanimity, all of these, beautiful qualities of mind, loving kindness, appreciative joy, compassion. We spend a lot of time and energy in our practice and in our instructions supporting the idea of like kind of perfecting the mind and, bolstering its ability to be okay and connected and caring no matter what the conditions are. And that is true. Of course, it's not to go back on everything we teach most of the time, but there is also the other truth of understanding that consciousness itself is dukkha. That there's some aspect of it, even the most beautiful qualities of mind, that there's still something oppressive in them. They're still conditioned phenomena. They arise because of conditions, right? The mind arises because of contact with the six sense doors and mind, right? These things sort of come together to produce consciousness, awareness, knowing of phenomena, and then all of the mental phenomena that arises from that: agitation or peace or clinging or grasping, some of the things that Michelle mentioned in her instructions this afternoon. But to really understand that it is also conditioned, that it is also impermanent. The mind, consciousness is always appearing and disappearing, dependent upon conditions. that there is this constant impingement upon the sense doors, upon the mind of experience, the relentlessness to that, and that it is ultimately unsatisfactory, even equanimity, right? Even loving kindness, to understand that they also are not self, right? That they are also of a not me or my nature is fundamental to our relief and release from them as well. And so it's hard because we put in a lot of energy in trying to improve the mind, improve our concentration, improve our dexterity of mind, improve the flexibility, the capacity for peace. But there's also an important practice and understanding of letting go of the mind, letting go of hope for the mind, letting go of an agenda with the mind, of an expectation that it's going to bring us satisfaction. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha says, is in this sutta about dyads. He goes into dyads about consciousness and volitional action and ignorance and craving and contact and the whole realm of things kind of related to dependent origination. Whatever suffering originates is all conditioned by consciousness. This is one contemplation. With the remainderless fading away and cessation of consciousness, there is no origination of suffering. This is the second contemplation. When a bhikkhu dwells thus, the teacher further said this: whatever suffering originates is all conditioned by consciousness. With the cessation of consciousness, there's no origination of suffering. Having understood this danger, that suffering is conditioned by consciousness, by the stilling of consciousness, a bhikkhu, hungerless, has attained nibbana. It's a very kind of subtle and important aspect of the teachings to also recognize that while these mental qualities that we cultivate are beautiful, that it is actually their cessation that is the deepest peace, and that has the ability to be an ongoing permanent peace, because this nibbana is not conditioned, is not dependent upon conditions. It is a conditionless um, aspect of reality, not coming and going, not moving, not changing, but in which even consciousness doesn't arise. Many of you have heard this chant that we will often offer, where it's important to honor and recognize the impermanence of things. Anicca vata sankhara upadavaya damino upajituva nirujanti tesam upasamo sukho. Anicca vata sankhara, all conditioned things are impermanent. Upadavaya damino, their nature is to arise and pass away. Upajitva nirujanti, having arisen, they come to an end. Tesam upasamo sukho, their cessation brings bliss. Oftentimes we'll offer a sort of different framing of that last line, right? That their understanding of the arising and passing of all things brings happiness, brings peace, brings bliss. And that is the implication. That's through the understanding, the insight, the acknowledgement, the profound relationship with the arising and all and passing of all things, that the mind stops conjuring them, right? That we start to see that so much of what the mind is fabricating and creating in terms of consciousness is inspired through greed, hatred, and delusion. And when those things have dissipated through insight, through understanding, right, through disenchantment, that actually they come to stillness, they come to this experience of cessation, this nibbana, which means extinguishment, which is the deepest peace, something that a fully enlightened being has, uh, is said to have very easy access to. That many, depending on certain conditions or, qualities of concentration and things they might have developed, often have this ability to simply drop into this unconditioned state and come out according to um, some decision they've made or on the timing or coming out because there is a momentum of formation of karma that all beings have to live out, even arahants. So consciousness will reassert itself at some point. The body will reassert itself. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting will reassert themselves at some point. Until the conditions that lead to those ultimately come to dissipate. And so this notion that does the enlightened being exist uh, after the passing away of the body is this, kind of koan of it neither is said to exist nor to not exist. Because how would you say what happens to a flame when the fuel is extinguished? You wouldn't say that the flame left. You wouldn't say it went one place or another. It doesn't apply to the situation in which extinguishment has happened. So, in similar as you can't, not just after an enlightened being has passed away, but even before they've passed away, there's not a way to lock in the sense of beingness, um, presence in the way that we're used to understanding or describing it. Partly why the phrase of that they would refer to the Buddha, the one thus gone, Tathagata. So, how important it is to understand without agitation, without striving. Of course, the more we aim for any experience, the more suffering that's going to entail. But to also see that there's a way that it can lead to striving, but there's a way that it can be such a relief from striving, because if we understand that the extinguishment of greed, hatred, and delusion, the Buddha would sometimes be accused of teaching annihilation, that this is a teaching of annihilation, and he rejected that. Or he said, if I teach annihilation, it's the annihilation of defilements of the mind, but not of the self, not of being, not of who we are. It's the true direct comprehension of reality, of the nature of phenomena and of mind and matter and what's really going on. And so sometimes I do think in our practice we can be so focused on perfecting the mind that subconsciously there is an attachment to it. We have a future inclination toward a kind of experience of the mind, of awakened mind, of who we'll be and what kind of mind it will be, that keeps us entangled in the entanglements, versus a relationship with the mind where we let go of any sense of agenda or expectation of it being fulfilling, right? That even this idea that when we're enlightened, the mind will be a fulfilling experience, that it will be stable, that it'll be self, right? That we will be enlightened. And having some sense that that is a misperception also, and that it's okay if the mind extinguishes itself as well. Consciousness not arising actually can be a relief. And that really the only way to do that is to observe consciousness, right? To be involved. It's like we can't abandon consciousness. This doesn't mean that we abandon the practice and we just let the mind let it. When we say let it go, it doesn't mean that we stop being in relationship with it. But perhaps there's a way we can stop wrestling with it, stop trying to force it to be the mind we want it to be, stop trying to force ourselves to be at peace with being stuck in traffic or be at peace with the Bureau of Conveyances or the shopping mall or whatever much worse dukkhas that you may have gone through in the last few days, of course. These are just silly, mundane. But this sense of like, oh, I should be okay with this. Okay, how can I try to find a sense of compassion for myself? Or like, those are beautiful tools. We'll never say don't do those things. Yes, if you feel dukkha, if you feel suffering, incline towards care. Oh, can you find a place of connection through that? Is there any sense of equanimity? But what does it also mean to let go of expectation or agenda with the mind? Oh, things aren't how they want them to be. There's disappointment. There's impatience. There's wanting. There's not wanting. Perhaps feeling the way in which that is an incredible unhooking from dukkha, from our own suffering. That's very important. One of my great influences in my life was a couple named Wally and Juanita Nelson, who I met in high school, and I worked on their farm in the afternoons, and um, they were elderly already at that point, living in a very, very simple life, less than an acre of land that they farmed, and they had no electricity, no running water. And they had made that choice to live that way on purpose, wanting to live in a simple way. They were both black activists, long time civil rights activists for many years, and decided that they didn't want to participate in war. And so their primary focus was living under the taxable income level so that they didn't feel like they were supporting war killing through their income tax. And Wally told me a very beautiful story from his difficult childhood. His family grew up as sharecroppers in Arkansas. And there was some period when he was maybe like 9 or 10 years old where his father was not well. And his father would have done a lot of the field work, but he wasn't well. And so Wally had to take that work on at some point, and he had never done it. And so he was trying to get the mule. He had hooked up the plow to the mule and was trying to plow their field with this mule. But he was so light that the mule just like didn't recognize him even being there and was just going crisscross and crazy all around the field, running around. And while he was terrified, and he's just found himself like grasping more and more to the reins and tugging on them and trying to get this wild animal under control. All the while, his neighbor was at the fence, kind of laughing, and an older gentleman was yelling out to him, but he couldn't hear what he was saying. And so, while I was trying to hear what he was saying, couldn't hear, trying to manage this wild mule, until finally the mule went close enough to the neighbor to hear what he was saying, and the neighbor was yelling out. He said, "Let loose the line, fool, and you'll be free." And so Wally let go of the reins, and the mule came to a stop, and he came to a stop. And he said it was such a profound lesson for him, I think more than he could have conceived as a child, but that so directed his life in terms of seeing the violence that it took to try to control something that you were at odds with, that you didn't believe in, that you wanted to behave a certain way, but that was more powerful than you. And yet that actually the solution, the answer to the problem was not in getting more powerful and more aggressive and more assertive and more violent, but actually in letting go of the reins. And that there was something incredibly powerful in that for himself and for the mule, that actually in that act of letting go, he himself was safe and was calmed, but the mule itself also was calmed and quieted down. And that this was a metaphor that they used for their decision to have non-payment of taxes, right, through the choice of poverty, as a letting go of the reins, as a stop trying to fight, and this other sort of kind of tai chi maneuver, right, of how to come to peace and how to create peace in the world. And that story always had a very profound effect on me as well. And when I came to meditation, I, something very easily translated in that for me around our relationship with our mind. That of course there are times where we are training the mind and where we are learning to concentrate and we're bringing the attention back to something. And it's not, again, not trying to throw out all of that out the window. It is a beautiful, important, fundamental part of our practice life. But there is also this other part of letting go of the reins, of stop trying to control everything all the time, including the mind, which often means including ourselves. And to understand that actually that letting go can start to create a lot of peace in the mind, in our relationship to it, and also in the experience of it. And so it's very practical in terms of like when we sit, we come to meditation, when we're anchoring in the body or anchoring whatever, and the mind is very active, or just to remember that mind can be something we observe. Consciousness is something we can observe. Feeling tone is something we can observe. Where can we simply just try to watch the mind, really without agenda, and even be willing to see it very unclearly, to let the mind be very messy, to be very sloppy, to be kind of incoherent. That's also very important because often if we're looking for like extreme clarity in our relationship to anything, but particularly the mind, then we're tightening the mind as we're trying to see the mind. And most often our primary entry point is going to be in just the mind as it is, which is like incoherent, slobbering, nonsensical, ethereal, happening faster than we can really keep up with, incoherent, not fully formed thoughts, impressions, ideas, fabrications of the mind. To kind of let the sort of just bubbling up of all of the kind of gobbledygook just be there and be what we're observing in the mind. And to trust that that is actually good practice, right? That is the practice we start to see, oh, the mind is really just like hearing, or just like the body, arising based on conditions, passing away based on conditions. No self, nothing, nothing solid enough to be ultimately satisfying in it. Nothing solid enough to be a self, to be able to control or be controlled. Letting repugnant thoughts arise, letting thoughts that we love about ourselves arise, watching the contraction, watching the aversion, watching all of these things arise instead of trying to feel like if we perfect the mind, we're going to have the mind we want, we'll be satisfied, we'll be the people we want to be in some sort of future state. It's like, oh, we have to recognize the dukkha of the mind, the dukkha of consciousness, the exhaustion of it. There's it wasn't really a funny article, but there are funny things about it. And I read recently of like a lot of younger people who they don't like email. People are using texting and, Instagram, and they're, on Facebook Messenger. They're using all these other apps. And some of these quotes were great. It was like this kid, this, I don't know, young person. It was like, email is just like, it's where everything that's stressful is like waiting for you, And another person was like, every time I get an email, I feel like I'm getting stabbed. And it was it's so extreme, it's such an extreme kind of sensitivity. But there was actually something that I appreciated about it, of like really getting the relentlessness of experience. And of course, like the fantasy that somehow by diffusing them to like different platforms, it's going to be like less suffering, is like, they'll see how that works out for folks. But I do think that there is this sort of like the relentlessness of experience, right? And the responsibility of each moment of knowing, of each moment of email, of each moment, whatever. It's like this sense of something you have to deal with, and process and hold and carry and have to do something with it before it goes away or whatever. And where is there any relief from that? You know, where is there a sense of just like watching the mind come and go? You know, the I had a radio show this morning and I played an Otis Redding song and there was some, he said, I can't do what 10 people want me to do. You know, that sense of it reminds me of the emails or just like, oh, we're all like this inundation of sort of expectation. And so just watching the ship come in and watching them roll out again, you know, it's like, can we have that sense of, of, of just restfulness and lack of expectation, even with the mind, you know, I always feel like that's such good practice. And so, you know, it's not just in our meditation. I really feel like I want to encourage any kind of place where you can feel like do, doing nothing, you know, where you don't have to satisfy the mind or entertain the mind, even if it's just for a few minutes a day, or you're standing in line at the post office, or you're waiting for something, to not just distract ourselves all the time, you know, with a cell phone or with reading or whatever. But like, can we sit and just watch the mind? You know, watch these ships roll in, watch them roll back out again, you know, watching the tide come in, watching the tide go out. Just like, where do we start to develop a taste for that lack of expectation, the natural patience that's beyond patience, right? A sense of no attachment to any future state. So much of that is not just with the world around us, but actually with our own minds. Of course, with our own bodies, it's also very difficult. But to not leave out the mind as a place that we're letting go of and that we're relinquishing hope for in a very real way. Not to say, of course, we don't have some faith that liberation is possible. It's a different quality of hope, right? It's a different quality of expectation and of of feeling like our happiness and well-being is locked in to some experience, even an internal mental experience. And what might it mean for the mind to even be freed from that, from not needing things to even be the way we want them to be internally as much as externally? The sense of the deepest peace that's possible. I think I'll leave it at that for now. So thank you. As usual, we do have some time for questions. If anyone has any questions about your practice, questions about Michelle's meditation instructions, questions about anything I've offered, we're happy to help support you in your practice in whatever way we can. So again, there should be a reactions button on the bottom of your screen, or one that just says raise hand. Maybe it's in that reactions button. If you have a question, we can call on you. Otherwise, if that is too complicated, you can into the chat button there, you can type that you have a question and we'll call on you. Hey Kay, let's see, I think you can unmute there.
Hi, everyone. Um, well, the question is not forming well, but um, I I think I'm struggling with I feel like I'm asking over and over the same question. I'm just struggling with the behavior of, including mental behavior, my speech and action, and how much of it is, like you said, Jesse, like conditioned, and it's it's not going anywhere. But every time I notice something, I just wanna just fix it until I'm like, oh, resistance, or oh, what is that? Okay, oh, what is the difference between behavior and there's something other than that, like a quality that you might talk about, um, even like inviting some quality that as behavior. um, I think I like a little clarity, if there are any.
Like, also, can I ask, like, do you feel like any of it is coming up more acutely because you're having more interactions, and like that your behavior externally or internally is like kind of reverberating in a new way, or just really it's just sort of like internal and external and kind of feels ongoing?
I do notice a lot of more movements are happening around me, like whether it involves me or not. So I do feel that a little bit of an overwhelm in general.
Michelle, do you have anything you want to start with, or would you like me to? You're muted there.
I think I need to understand more what you mean by behavior. And if you don't mind.
Me too. Um, the I think what, like obsessive nature of like cleaning up, or maybe that could be behavior, I think, or the trying to calm myself down when something happens, something aggravating happened, the trying to, and oh no, I'm gonna just meditate away, or those, is that a behavior? I'm not even really sure if that's a behavior.
Yeah. Well, I can start. I think that what Jesse was referring to, I think, in his talk was that a lot of the suffering we experience comes from like that moment that you're describing where you're trying to calm yourself down, right? But you know, it always comes down to motivation, and that's what's hard for us. Like, are we calming ourselves down because we're not accepting being riled up? Right? I mean, this sounds so basic, but I think this is where it's really hard. That place of thinking that it's better if we were calm, and that's the ideal place to be, right? That's like, even when I introduced expectation as at the beginning of the instruction, it's like I think that I often will teach expectation as the killer of connection, meaning that's how serious it is. So that expectation that being really calm is the preferred state, or not obsessing about cleaning or whatever, right? Like that there's a preferred place, and then, which is often more pleasant, and then there's the places where there isn't a receptive attention, like we're not receiving the energy of being riled up, and that the as the Buddha taught, the aversion to that state and then trying to get away from it more through the meditation practice, that's what's so painful. Yeah. So we often miss the step. I also was caught. I had a very important appointment I went over to Honolulu for, and there was also this unexpected traffic jam. I was also in an Uber for an hour and a half. And I had this critical appointment. It was just like, and I'm injured, and it's really hard to be sitting in a car anyway. And watching my mind, like, it kept going to the place where, no, wait a minute. No, I actually, there can't be a traffic jam today because I actually have to get this appointment, right? Like the level to which I was not like in touch with like those moments of where I would really go to just kind of shifting back to accepting that I wasn't maybe going to make the appointment, right? And the disappointment of that. It's just so, you watch, like, what can be very interesting is for me to ask you, what do you think it would be like to shift to receiving the textures and vibrations of being riled up? Which is what I kept doing that whole 90 minutes of the traffic jam, was mostly accepting that I was riled up, right? But it's not like it makes it pleasant to accept it. And I think that's where we all get messed up, is really like, we think if we accept something that it's going to make it maybe pleasant, but it was actually, it continued to be unpleasant, but it made the experience bearable.
Right. It's not acceptable.
Right.
Feel it. No.
Well, that's what I would, it's like, I don't feel like I can say that I think it's the best practice to be in the taxi for 90 minutes in a totally riled up place either. It's like I actually laid down a few times and I asked the driver, is that okay? And, was with my breath. And then I kept trying to figure out where I was in I was trying to figure out how far along I was by the trees and the buildings. And, I was taking breaks from the fact that I might not make the appointment. Yeah. So like you take breaks from the being riled up. Does that sound like possible, more workable if you take like little breaks?
Sometimes, yes, I think so. Just, yeah. Sometimes grip is so strong that it feels like there's no way but to be in the place in between resistant to riled up and being riled up, and just that crack I'm just getting stuck in. But sometimes I can go somewhere else when I notice that.
Yeah. I mean, that's important. It's so important for us to know it's okay that we take a break. Yeah. It's so important. I mean, my day continued like that, by the way. Like I had another appointment after that appointment that was also felt really important. And I was again waiting for an Uber driver, and that took, it was downtown Honolulu traffic. And again, it was like watching myself. And what was, I mean, I find I often choose to do something different. So there was a woman waiting in front of this hospital that had been there when I walked in, like, in a hurry. I walked in, she was sitting there waiting for a ride. And when I came out, and my appointment was very long and the doctor was late, blah, 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 blah. But when I came out, she was still sitting there. And then I started getting impatient. And then I sat down with her and I'm like, you've been here like so long and I'm already getting impatient, right? I was just like having fun, and we had a really nice chat, and I took my mind off it for a while, and she appreciated. She said, you noticed me? And I said, yeah, it's like you've been here forever, and it's just like I think that sometimes for me, kind of connecting with the human existential predicament with others when I'm in one, is really, it brings a kind of lightness and compassion. I just really recommend that anything that you can do to find a way to connect, that a lot of us are in the modern world tend to get riled up. You know, I don't know if you have something else to say, Jesse, but you know, it's a part of this practice is relaxing into being riled up.
Okay, Bill.
Hi. Thank you for your talk today, Jesse. It was very helpful. Um, it inspired a question for me. Lately, in my daily practice and my daily days, um, uh, I've been noticing there's some like sort of uh, just mind states and memories that are coming up that are from the past that are very challenging, and they come from challenging times, but also memories uh, have been coming up that are part of more positive emotions and kind of come with kind of they have I feel like they have aspects of strength for the mind and strength in for connection with other people and so on. And I'm wondering if there's a relationship kind of to what you're saying, because I feel like this has been naturally happening. Like I'm not trying to make it happen. I'm not trying to find these experiences. They're just like these moments in my youth that are coming back, very powerful moments of emotion where there's been moments of strength, even though they come up with these more traumatizing times as well. And I'm wondering if there's a connect. It feels natural, and I guess what I'm wondering is when is there a connection to letting go of the kind of expectation that you're talking about that allows the mind to have some of its own process in the way I'm saying. Um, and but you know but I'm being, you know, and in a sincere way though, in the surrender you're talking about really letting go, like encouraging that, okay, tomorrow I know I'm going to go to work and I'm probably am going to get identified with experience. I probably am going to become reactive and maybe lose my awareness, lose my calm even, and know that now. So, and kind of know that that's part of what happens, and that maybe there's a trust that, okay, that's going to happen, but that there's still ground for practice. Yeah, I don't know. I know that's a bit scattered, but it's kind of my
No,
question.
I think that's a really cool way of kind of thinking about that and considering it. And I do think there's something absolutely related. I mean, I think that there is this dance of like, on one hand, we're so powerfully responsible for what we do mentally, in speech and in action, right? And so there's on one hand a kind of growing sensitivity to our behavior, you know, as been sort of said, right? Of like, oh, the mental culture that we have uh, is has its complexities, and yet and parts of it that might be harmful to ourselves or others, or you know, things that aren't we're not necessarily proud of, you know, things we might be ashamed of in certain ways. And there is also, I think, in that coming to like really understand it more, and in the opening up to the full range of joy and sorrow and pride and shame and, you know, challenges and feeling of healthy connection and, you know, healthy pride, you know, um, and understanding why things are the way they are in our minds, you know, and what why things are, you know, have developed in the ways that they might have. That also does give us a little bit of space to accept the unskillfulness at times, right? The imperfections of the mind and the places where it's continues to be challenging and where patterns continue to be difficult. So I definitely think that there is in the sort of letting go of our trying to always have the perfect mental experience, there is the acceptance of things that is liberating, and that if it's happening with enough awareness, that it doesn't have to lead to unskillful behavior externally, right? That there are ways, and not that it won't sometimes, all of that, but there is a way that it's like developing more skillfulness and wholesome behavior isn't just about self-control. It's also about like, oh, that these things can sort of play out in the mind, even anger. And actually, the more you kind of give room for it, and the less you're not freaked out by it, and the more relationship you have with it, or when you are freaked out by it, you can hold that too. And then it's like, oh, there's room, there's space, even in more tense places and more tense experiences in our day or whatever. So I definitely, absolutely think so. And I think going even more basically of like and similar maybe also to Kay's question of just like there are just different levels of good practice. Like there's different approaches to good practice. Good practice doesn't have to be just one thing or another. And so there's ways in which it's like, oh, we have like powerful memories arising, and that can be really, you that can happen in a way that feels very connected and sobering, but also grounded or whatever, I mean, jarring, but it can feel sort of with it, and then powerful positive memories and positive experiences, and kind of going through a period of sort of memories and psychological kind of history of ourselves that can be positive. Of course, there are ways that that can turn into practice that might not be so aligned with Vipassana, right? If we're thinking about it and kind of getting more sort of mixed in it and evaluating and, just thinking more versus observing. But it's like, okay, that's a level. I do think there's also the level of like, um, at times, observing the mind before those notions are even fully formed, right? Before the memory is fully coherent and fully becomes a sense of me and who I was. There are times where we can, or this pattern of mind, or, my whatever things we notice about ourselves, you can kind of look really, more, the present moment is pretty short, right? It's happening pretty quickly. And so there are also ways that like we can observe the mind in a way that's maybe less formed, less coherent, less solid, but also can be good practice, right? And it's going to have distinct qualities, and those might, in terms of part of what I was talking about in my talk, that some of the value of that can be an unhooking, as well, of just like, oh, like but by the time a thought becomes a full memory, where there's actually a lot of back and forth in that, there's a lot that's gone into a full memory of ourselves, positive or negative. And so there are times also where it's like, oh, we can observe thought before it kind of blossoms, and then there's a new thought and a new notion, a new conjuring, and that it's a sort of different aspect of observing the mind, and both are good, and both can have their sort of positive ways.
Yeah. That's that answers a lot of my question. I think funny when I have a question, I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but yeah, it's what you just said is very helpful, because it's like the memories, even when they're positive, it feels like this is actually something I've pushed away from my life, like the ability to have connection with somebody in a deep way, or a connection with a group, for example. But it does feel like, yeah, this is, you know, in this time, in this place, in the past, and it's still alive, but and so
Totally.
maybe it is about working with that in a way that is conducive to Vipassana. I guess maybe that is what I was wondering in a way.
I think so, and I think this what I'm going to say doesn't necessarily. I don't know to what degree it fits into like classical kind of Vipassana framework, but I do think that there are times where it's helpful to consider the mind as something that is just like unwinding itself, where it's like if you're not fueling it, right? If you're not sort of like rebuilding the fuel of these memories and the impact and the emotional sort of, if you're not conjuring more on it, there is a way that the practice can sort of feel like you're just sort of stepping back and just letting it all kind of play out, right? That there's a momentum of past action and energy that needs to kind of play out. And part of why it hasn't is because we've been fighting with it. We've been like, don't think that, don't remember this, you shouldn't have done that, guilt, shamed, or whatever it is, versus like the more the mind can sort of like let something kind of come and go on its own, that something gets resolved in it for sure. That is for me has been an important part of the practice. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know. Michelle,
Yeah.
anything you want to add to that?
I'm not sure if this relates totally to the memory aspect of what you asked about, but I think in terms of when you describe going to work and kind of assuming something isn't going to go the way you want. There was a certain point in my practice where for many years I would want to make a phone call home, but I really wanted to talk to my dad, and my stepmother had a very difficult way of relating to me, and yet she would always answer the phone and hardly ever let me talk to my dad. And so so even making a phone call was sort of like how I would describe you going to work, where I would like whatever I would like to plan or try to want to avoid or get or whatever, all the expectation. When I started meditating, I started formally practicing meditation. I started shifting my whole way of relating to it. It still took courage to call, but I would be like, oh, this is what happens when I call home, right? It was like, it, I would try to make the possibility for some equanimity. And the equanimity is really an acceptance that has no conditions, right? So to have an acceptance with no conditions on your way, on going to work every day, that's asking a lot. But I would kind of set the tone for that I would react and that it wasn't bad practice. Do you see what I mean? I wasn't, rather than think, not only, it wasn't like, oh, this is what happens when I call, but that included all the reactions I would have. Do you see?
Yeah.
And that's like, I'm just kind of amplifying what Jesse's saying, and what it's like, what happens with that is that it makes space for all possibility. It made space for a teeny bit more compassion for my stepmother over time, for example. And it made space for like me realizing that I was looking forward to conversation with my dad, which hardly ever manifested as much, even if he did get on the phone. You know what I mean? Like all of us kind of like wanting, didn't really play out that great, but it was like, I think that experience over years started to teach me what equanimity really is, and the genuine equanimity without conditions. The without conditions included my aversion to the situation.
Yeah.
Or like when I would say something to my stepmother that was really not helpful in the situation. Do you see what I mean? And just like seeing myself go over, just over years, I guess I would say this is why I have such faith in the practice, and faith in when we think something is not going our way and we're not surrendering to it in the way that we wish, which is a lot of the stuff that happens in our life, that rather than think it's bad practice, that we start shifting to it's good practice, to start even having the courage to keep looking, making space for it, this is what happens when I go to work, that makes space for possibility. It might not sound like it. It sounds paradoxical, but actually this is what happens when I call home. It would start making space for me having more flexibility, and my stepmother and my dad was oblivious to the situation, so he didn't have to do anything. But do you see what I mean? It's kind of, it gives me great faith, and gave me great faith that we can all do this, because it's a kind of acceptance of non-acceptance.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, you both.
Yeah, thank you. Victor.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey.
Okay. Good to see you, and thank you for the talk. I just had an experience recently where I was focusing intently on just watching. A little bit of concentration was present, and I felt like my fear eased, and I feel like I moved into a, a state where there wasn't so much of me trying to meditate or me trying to find metta or find relief. And I just wondered, as a basic principle in my question, are we always trying to strengthen the watcher to make space for that and other things? Is that like a constant, like we're always weightlifting to try and strengthen the watcher to get relief from what we're conjuring up?
You want to start, Michelle?
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
great question.
Mhm.
Am I on? Yeah, okay. I suppose it would be important to define the watcher. So it's like, I think any time that the awareness can, the idea of witnessing or observing what's happening, that is a kind of freedom, like that is very different than being lost in thought about it and caught and identified with an experience. So yes, the ability to have enough spaciousness to pay attention rather than be caught and identified is certainly, we're trying to strengthen that, and we're trying to strengthen all kinds of things within that awareness can actually kind of come in closer, immerse itself in the experience, or step back and be more distant but observing, or that the witness can go inside the experience or step out, or like all that flexibility that the observing or witness can have kindness or equanimity, or all, that there's, yes, we're trying to strengthen all the qualities. We're infusing that. We're not only strengthening it, but we're infusing that watcher with all kinds of spiritual qualities that bring more and more flexibility and balance and freedom. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that, just to, like Michelle, it'd be a little careful with the language around like the watcher as creating. It's one of these like very subtle places where it's difficult to, you can't find perfect language, right? But while we're trying to have a quality of observation that is not so identified as me, it's also not trying to have it be identified as other either, right? Like that there's some other watcher, or that it's a divine presence or something like that. And so it's like the just to be careful of like every way that we try to frame it in terms of language is going to set us up to some kind of framework that's going to have its limitations. That's all. And so this sense of like, yes, it's absolutely trying to deepen, expand the capacity to observe, for the mind to be able to observe what's happening uh, in the mind itself, and other sense stores, and whatever kind of frame that it's and it is, and observation is a mental quality. But this sense of like it's not necessarily my mind, or it's not necessarily your mind, or some other mind, but mind is watching, is part of what I think is important to just also have integrated to some degree into the way that we talk about it. Yeah. But it sounds like a
Yeah,
beautiful experience. I mean, just what you're describing, it's just like you're there, there's presence, there's some qualities of like peace and non-agitation and non-striving and not trying to make anything happen. It's very beautiful.
yeah, thank you. It was struggle free,
It's
and
wonderful.
it was hard to stay there. It did have like a little sense of divine, like I'm here, and speed, like the rain, my body, my striving, and then a little falling back into my what I was doing, then back out into um, a watching presence that was, yeah, struggle free.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Yay.
yeah, hooray,
Even a moment.
hooray.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Victor.
okay, cheers.
Iswar.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I just had a question about the sutta you mentioned, kind of the relationship between consciousness and nibbana. So I like the way it's usually taught is you try to eliminate craving to reach enlightenment. So kind of the way of phrasing it in terms of consciousness seems a bit different. So I was kind of curious whether it's mainly talking about the state of nibbana has no consciousness, so rather than the goal of the practice is to not have consciousness, right? Do you kind of understand what I'm asking? Yeah.
Totally.
That's
Totally.
great.
It's really helpful too, because someone else asked a question in a message that I wanted to address that's related. That sutta in particular is going through sort of like the stages, and it's not in the sort of normal order, but of what's the kind of dependent origination of like, how does this experience of me and arise based on the coming together of all these conditions, right? And then how does it perpetuate itself? And so there's this idea that it's like, based on ignorance, there's craving, and based on craving, there's coming into being. I'm not going to get it exactly right. And based on that, right. So there's like the six sense bases. There's the mind and matter. And based on in some interweaving of those things, consciousness arises. And then from consciousness, there's inclination, and there's craving and wanting and grasping, and then becoming again, right? The sense of like we become through this process. And so in this sutta, the idea is that like any part of that stage of events, if seen clearly and totally accepted and totally um, you know totally integrated into understanding, any part of that experience that's seen very clearly stops that chain from unfolding. It stops becoming from happening. It stops the chain of continued existence and rebirth and all of that, right? So there's this sort of metaphysical aspect of it, but there is also this momentary, immediate aspect of it that, without the six sense doors, the consciousness then doesn't arise. Without consciousness arising, craving doesn't arise, and that basically you can stop it sort of at any point, and that you can consider any part of it to be the source of suffering, right? Like any part of that chain of events is a place where we can intervene, and any part of it is what leads to some next moment of suffering. What someone asked, and I want to clarify, is like it doesn't mean that death is the ending of consciousness, like that is the goal. And this is part of what the Buddha, even in his own lifetime, was attacked about, right? That people would be like, oh, you're worshiping annihilation, you're worshiping death, like, and it's like in this framework, death is not the end of consciousness. As much as we might hope that it would be some kind of relief, that it would provide some, like, it's very clear that it doesn't, right? It's like that actually this particular sort of physical manifestation of body will come to an end. As long as there's craving, as long as there's still wanting or not wanting in the mind, it's going to lead to some kind of continued existence, right? And so, of course, it gets into more metaphysical stuff. But yes, right, this idea is like we're not aiming for there are different ways of framing it. So I want to actually be careful before I say we're not aiming for the cessation of experience, because there are ways in the tradition that it's talked about where, if as nibbana, as the cessation of becoming, is talked about as sort of the goal, right? Other times it's talked about as the eradication of craving based on understanding, right? Or the eradication of ignorance based on insight. So again, it's like it just sort of depends, like where on this, at what moment are we looking at where we talk about what's the goal, right? And so I think that there is a much easier, kind of more palatable and understanding, kind of easier to understand and kind of work on sense of like, oh, we're trying to get rid of craving because craving is causes dukkha, it feels like dukkha, and it causes more of it, and we see that it creates unhealthy, dynamics in our own lives, in our minds, and in the minds of others. And yet there is also the truth that it's like to know that when craving ceases, becoming also ceases. And so there is a sense of cessation in that, the cessation of tension, of craving, of anguish, of suffering. So there's also sort of like different ways of talking about what is the cessation of what, And I think that we also don't tend to speak so much about the ending of craving, partly because, we live in a world and are products of a society that has so demonized like pleasure and the sense that we should be ashamed of feeling of pleasure or needing kind of wholesome positive things. And so the sort of sense of it can feel very judgmental to say sort of like craving. So we tend to focus, you might hear us more talk about ignorance as like the more essential fundamental thing that we're trying to work on, right? That insight and is the result of understanding, because we're observing mind, we're observing body, and that it leads to understanding, leads to insight, and that the wisdom that comes from that will naturally leads to the non-arisal of craving, right? The non-arisal of hatred. So we don't necessarily need to talk about the cessation of craving and the cessation of hatred. We talk about the arising of wisdom or the arising of insight. So a lot of it is like language that you try to be kind of careful with, um, depending on what's the context around who, what's the sort of like mental mind body formation. So there's a way that it's all sort of the same, and there's a way that, yes, there are different ways of talking about it for sure. I don't know if that was helpful or more confusing. I don't know. Michelle, do you have anything you want to add? Does that make, I don't know, how did that make sense?
Yeah. So I mean, from the framework of dependent or origination, that makes sense. But I mean, like the way I usually think of it as is you try to make the cut at craving. That's the way I had heard it before. So I wasn't sure whether, you should try to, in some instances, cut it at consciousness. It just didn't seem kind of right. But yeah.
Right. Well, no, but I think it's insightful to say you can't just willfully stop consciousness from
Right.
arising, right?
Right. Exactly.
And I mean, I think it's still a valid question of, can you willfully stop craving from arising? And ultimately, what is the mechanism of transformation? Is it a willful act, or is it the release that comes through insight, right? And I think ultimately we would say that it's always going to be that, and that at different times the intervention might happen at different places, that it might really be, someone might really have the sense of like, oh, becoming, and the distaste for that, or the sense of, of craving as being very distasteful, and the disenchantment with that experience, or the sense of the relentless impingement on the sense doors, right? Of being like, oh, this is suffering, and so again, kind of like, and when you look at the Four Noble Truths as a Vipassana practice, the sense of like, oh, this is suffering. And actually that's how this sutta begins, breaking up the Four Noble Truths into two other dyads. This is suffering, this is the cause of suffering, as like one contemplation. This is the release of suffering, and this is the way to the release of suffering, as a second contemplation, before it even gets into the other thing. So this sense of wherever the intervention can happen, it's this understanding that each moment of these things, each moment of this process can be seen as suffering, and you see what is the cause of it, what came just before it, and then what's the avenue towards, what's the possibility of relief, and then what's the avenue to the possibility of relief. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, Michelle.
I think that one of the difficult aspects of teaching how to work with craving or wanting is that it requires seeing it clearly versus wanting to get rid of it. And so again, I tend to always talk about the purification of motivation, but it's like some of the practice is really being able to, as Jesse is saying, I'm saying it in a little different angle only, is that the Buddha called it the suffering that ends suffering, which is to be able to observe the wanting and learn not to identify with it. So that the wanting will actually disappear by itself. There's no struggle in that. You have enough strength of awareness that's not identified with the wanting. And this is this purification of mindfulness, purification of equanimity. I mean, again, I have so much faith in this that I know if people are developing mindfulness and equanimity, it'll be inevitable that they'll see this so clearly, they won't bite. The cessation of the craving comes from not biting for it, not needing it, seeing that it's just suffering, as Jesse's saying. And so I think that our languaging often is around having equanimity, meaning unconditional acceptance that the wanting will appear until your third stage of enlightenment, that you learn how to work with it so that it actually will disappear by itself if you don't bite. It's very cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. I'll actually, in the chat, I just put a link to that sutta if you want to look in it. This is a different translation. He calls it, this is Thanissaro, as dualities instead of dyads. And then actually, if anyone, I'll put this little link to, this is an essay I wrote about my relationship with Wally and Juanita Nelson a few years ago. All right, I think it's time to call it a day. Really wonderful to be here with you all again.
Have a good
Thank
week.
you.
Have a great week.
Yeah.
Blessings.
Thank you.